Muy buenas tardes. Good afternoon. Welcome to the YouTube channel of Instituto Cervantes, Manchester and Leeds. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to the first session of this fifth edition of Ex Libris Publications in Hispanic Studies. It's an initiative of the Instituto Cervantes in Manchester and Leeds in collaboration with Durham University. And it is a program coordinated by Professor Rosi, a distinguished scholar in Hispanic cultural studies, whose research has significantly contributed to our understanding of contemporary Spanish literature, popular culture, and memory studies. This program seeks to highlight and promote the most recent publications in the field of Hispanic studies, providing a space for academic reflection and exchange. Today, we gather to present the book Latin America and the Transport of Opera, Fragments of a Transatlantic Discourse by Dr. Robert Ignacio Díaz. Welcome, Ignacio. Welcome, Rosi. Thank you very much for being with us and for accepting the invitation. And Roberto, in this work, invite us to explore the intersection between opera and Latin America, and in a region that, while often considered or could be considered in the peripheral geographical space about opera, in fact, has played a crucial role in its circulation and reinterpretation. From a critical and multidisciplinary perspective, the book analyzes by key episodes in the history of opera in Latin America, addressing fundamental themes such as the influence of European cultural models, the ambivalence of scepticism, also the tensions between nationalism and cosmopolitanism, and the impact of this genre on the construction of regional identities. Through our exploration of works such as the Calderón de la Barca's Baroque play on Venus and Adonis, Alejo Carpentier's neo-Baroque novella Vivaldi's Montezuma, and contemporary interpretation of opera in literature and music, the author provides an innovative perspective of the significance of this art form in Latin American cultural history. And now let me give you some information about the curriculum of Dr. Roberto Ignacio Díaz. He's a distinguished academic and critic, currently holds the position of Professor of Hispanic and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California. He earned his PhD in Roman languages and literatures from Harvard University, and his research focuses on Latin American literature, literary and cultural history, with particular emphasis on transatlantic relations in the 19th and 20th century. He has written extensively on multilingualism in Spanish American literature and on the prose of Borges. His previous works, including, for example, The Transatlantic Gaze, European Scholarship and the Making of American Canon, demonstrate his commitment to exploring transnational cultural dialogues. He is, as I said, very focused on the relations of Latin America and Europe in culture in general, but especially in opera. And we are convinced that today launching this book, this honor for Instituto Cervantes Manchester and Leeds, will facilitate the understanding that how opera had influenced Latin American culture, but also vice versa. So I invite you to enjoy this presentation, and I also invite you to participate in the dialogue that will follow the talk with about 15 minutes for questions and answers. So thank you very much. Muchas gracias again. And I give the floor to Professor Rosi. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Pedro, for the introduction. Thank you again for providing the space for this conversation. Ex Libris, can't believe we're already on our fifth year. This year, we're changing our date from Tuesday to Thursday. So thank you so much to those joining us from home on this Thursday. Welcome and thank you so much, Roberto, for joining us. Thank you for accepting our invitation to come and talk with us this afternoon. And congratulations once again on the publication of your book, a fascinating incursion into the intersection or juncture, as you call it, between the world of opera, Latin America, fiction, cultural history, and much, much more. I would like to start our conversation today asking you what seems a very simple and naive question, but one that perhaps will allow you to unravel the complexities and richness of the subject of your book as you please. Why opera? Why Latin America? Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you very much, Rosi, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you also to the Instituto Cervantes of Manchester for having me here. This is really a wonderful opportunity to speak about the book on the other side of the world that the book deals with. It is a book about Latin America, but as you know, my emphasis has been on transatlantic relations and Europe, which makes sense in the context of opera. I don't know if everyone realizes to what extent the international repertoire of opera remains firmly European. If you look at any season of any of the major opera houses around the world, including Latin America, the United States, and so on, you will see that a huge percentage of that repertoire is European. The famous, as we used to call them, dead white European males, the dwems, are very much alive in opera. Um, so it is great to have a partly European audience here today. That question is an excellent one, Rosie, and it's actually a question that gave me a lot of trouble when I first started writing this book. Why opera and why Latin America? The answer to the first part of the question is very simple, and it has to do with the pleasure that I suddenly found I was having in the operatic text. I started liking opera far more passionately than I had ever done before. And I loved everything about opera, the music, the words, the stagings. And I was at a point in my career where I had recently gotten tenure here at USC. So I felt I had a bit of freedom to engage in researching something that I was not very familiar with. And something that I was actually not prepared to work on because, first and foremost, opera is about the music, and I am not a musicologist. But then again, I really wanted to write about opera, so I sort of hung on to the fact that opera is also a literary form because of the libretti. There's no such thing as wordless operas. So that gave me an excuse. And then the second part of the question, why Latin America? Well, there are two parts to that. Number one is that I was trained as a literary scholar of Latin America, and I felt that I wanted to remain within that disciplinary position. And that actually then triggered the question, what is there to say about opera that concerns Latin America, or what is there to say about Latin America that might concern opera? Um, so the first part of, it was kind of like what I did. I did Latin American literary studies, but then as I started researching, I found that there were all kinds of really interesting things happening in this junction, to use that word again, Rossi, or that convergence of Latin America and opera that I wanted to write about. And just a couple things more that I would add. One has to do also with the fact that when I started researching opera, there was a turn in operatic studies towards the verbal. A book had come out in the 1990s from Princeton University Press titled Reading Opera. and it was all about the importance of paying attention to the words and the stories of opera, the plot lines that operatic texts engaged in, which then gave created an open door for all kinds of methodological positions to enter the discussion of opera, namely feminist criticism, which,
Mhm.
of course, is nothing new in uh, literary studies, but also post-colonial theory. And I had to say things about those two things. With time, it became obvious that there were three main bodies of works that I was interested in, and these are the works that I sort of inventory in chapters 1 and 2. The first one is European operas about Latin America, of which there are a ton, and what they may have to say, for example, about the concept of exoticism, which I thought was going to be the prevalent position for European operas about Latin America, but it turns out that it's far more complicated than that. Yes, there is exoticism, but there's many other things happening at the same time. The second thing, the second body of works is Latin American operas themselves, specifically the libretti of those operas, and as it turns out, there is a vast range of operas written by Latin American composers or composers who we may now read as Latin American. I mean, the author of the so-called first Latin American opera is actually Spanish, and so is the librettist Calderón de la Barca. So in that sense, the meaning of Latin America should be understood broadly and chronologically, expansively. And finally, what I found, which I thought was really interesting, as part of all of this, was Latin American literature that reflects on opera, um, literary works that engage with opera as part of the plot or as an element that, for example, might obsess one of the protagonists, etc. So it turned out that Latin American literature itself, my field, was actually quite engaged with the study of opera.
Thank you. We're going to unpack literature later, but let me go back a
Okay.
little bit. And as you lay out these arguments and the framework of your work um, through all of these things that you've just highlighted, it is also clear that some general themes or lines connect the different chapters of your book, right? One is actually mobility. Another is place, or perhaps the signification of location, right? And I was fascinated actually about your characterization of ghostly transport, right? That indicates that movement. And in the context of, of our current studies on post-coloniality or decolonization. So can you expand on this idea of movement and traces left by opera as it connects to Latin American history, people, and culture? I know this is a complicated question, but perhaps you can trace this idea of transport, location, movement through an example. I can think of, for example, the marvelous stories that you tell in your book, particularly of the Manaus Opera House or on the topic of the Montezuma Atahualpa, for example.
Yes, this is a huge question and a central question to my discussion of opera. And many of the aspects of operatic history that you mentioned might be subsumed by the term that I decided to incorporate it into the title, the idea of transports. I thought it was a rich word, and a recent review of the book criticizes me for not theorizing it more. And my response to that would be that I think it's actually a pretty clear concept. I don't know what is there to theorize further, but of course, I'm sure there is something. But by transports, I meant first and foremost two things. One is the idea of motion, the idea that opera literally crosses the ocean. Well, literally, perhaps it's doing too much work here, but the art form is taken across the Atlantic Ocean to all parts of Latin America. Um, but that motion also implies emotions, emotions produced by opera. And here the idea of transport is great. I mean, I'm very lucky that there's a word, transport, that contains both ideas. I do not want to minimize the importance of opera as a gorgeous, special, cultural production. Uh, as you know, people who love opera do love opera. Um, it's not like, okay, I like, I don't know, field hockey. No, I mean, opera is a passion that consumes people. People travel extensively to attend a little performance of a work, that sort of thing. Um, so what does that mean? And I think the problem here is that these transports are associated with Europe, importing opera from Europe, as well as being subjugated by European forms. And here, when I say European, of course, Europe is vast and complex and complicated itself. But what I mean is mostly that operatic repertoire composed of Italian opera, German opera, French opera, first and foremost, and also, of course, Russian and Czech and English and even Spanish. But I started using the word ghostly because of that idea of the revenant, the idea that if you think about it, the cultural history of Latin America may be told as a process of independence from Europe, political as well as cultural. And the 19th century, which is one of the big centuries of opera, is also one of the crucial centuries for understanding the formation of Latin America. So what happens when you have Argentinian authors or Mexican authors, you name it, trying to come up with autonomous cultural formations, and suddenly here we have opera. It disrupts the sort of a clear rupture with Europe that some might call for. And Brazil is actually one interesting example, and I have to say that one of the big challenges for me writing this book was Brazil, because I'm old enough to belong to a generation of Latin Americanists who were not real Latin Americanists. We were Spanish Americanists. We ignored Brazil. An absurd thing if you think about it, because it's like writing about the United States without writing about California. I mean, that's how big and important Brazil is. So one of my big, quote unquote, discoveries was to find the richness of opera in Brazil, um, which is logical to some extent. I mean, here, royal um, dynasties play an important role. And as you know, Brazil was an empire for most of the 19th century. So there was an imperial theater importing opera. And there are major opera houses in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo and other cities. And Manaus is a famous example of it. As an anecdote, I'll tell you, whenever I was telling somebody in an elevator or whatever, I'm writing about Latin American opera, the first thing that people would say is, "Oh yeah, have you seen Fitzcarraldo?" And I would be, "Have I seen Fitzcarraldo? I have now seen many times," and I'm very thankful to Herzog that he made this film because it puts Latin American opera on some sort of map. And reading about the film was fascinating, but also reading about the actual theater and visiting the theater. As part of I was telling, I'll tell the audience, I was telling Rosi and others before we started our conversation that one of the good things about working on opera was that I had research funds from a university to travel virtually wherever I wanted to go see an opera or study an opera house. So I ended up going to Manaus, and it was just fabulous to take a tour of the opera house there, the Teatro Amazonas,
Mm,
uh, and to learn that all the uh, wood carvings are made of Brazilian wood sent to Portugal to be carved there and then transported back to to the to the to the um, uh, to the jungle,
mm,
as they say it. I mean, and of course, the idea of the jungle, again, is a very complicated concept. But in the film, what matters is opera in the jungle and the opera house in the jungle. Um, so I have to say that um, what you learn there is that a city like Manaus, and this is connected with the rubber barons, the cultivation of rubber in the jungle,
mm,
wanted to have a modern city. So they built streetcars and big streets, anything related to that idea of modernity, which had to include an opera house. So the opera house is there, quite literally present in the city. So we have, again, to go back to the idea of transports, we have the idea of opera being transported
mm,
to uh, Brazil in this particular case, the emotions that opera triggers. But even after that, even more transports, the translation of stories about the opera house into a film, and the
mm,
way in which that film has basically gone around the world to define, to some extent, the city of Manaus.
mm.
Um, yeah, it's
Yeah,
it's
yeah, it's just I felt that reading your book, it was just one story after the other because it's sort of almost it works as a chain because you always find something that you can continue that story because in a way the story of opera or the effect it had it never ends, right? It sort of links to other stories. So in fact, the approach that you take of this book, which is almost ahistorical, you jump times, you link stories, and so on, actually captures that complexity, and it always feels that it's not a finished story, right? So it's still an ongoing uh, phenomenon, an effect, perhaps. And I love, for example, we'll talk about that sort of the in the openness of your afterword. But let's go back to literature. So as you said, right, opera work as cultural references. Also, they're experiential, like that idea of transport. People get transported, when they see or hear opera. And I think that you do a very good uh, job at capturing that experience, how it's felt, how it's transformative. You're a beautiful writer, Roberto. It's
thank you.
amazing how you capture sort of those details. But also, you do come back to your own specialization research, your own training, which is literary studies. And opera, as you said, is about reading, but also there's adaptation going on. And
Mhm.
actually, the chapter that you dedicate to literature offers quite an inventory about literary references and adaptations when it comes to opera and Latin American and Hispanic literature. So I was wondering, in this compilation, did you discover your favorite read of an operatic libretto or perhaps a literary adaptation of such opera? And
That's a very
why?
good
What
question.
what what was great about that
Yeah,
about that work?
thank you for that question because I think it emphasizes the idea of pleasure, which I find crucial when you write about something. You should write about something that you are passionate about. And I was very lucky, for example, that one of the classics of Latin American literature of the 19th century is Estanislao del Campo's Fausto Criollo,
Mm,
which engages with Gounod's Faust in a very um, ironic, original way, and it's also been discussed by important critics of Latin American literature, from Enrique Anderson Imbert, who was one of my professors in graduate school, to Josefina Ludmer. So it sort of justified my incursion into opera to know that other people had paid attention to it. Um, but as I kept reading, I kept going back to one work, which is Alejo Carpentier's Concierto Barroco, a Baroque concert, which is a late novella. Um, and it takes place in Venice in the 18th century. And it deals with the first performance of Vivaldi's Montezuma, or as they call it in Italian, Moctezuma.
mm,
And the protagonist is a Mexican criollo who meets Vivaldi and tells him the story of Montezuma. And Vivaldi is very smart and says, you know, this sounds like an excellent story for an opera, which is actually true. There were many operas about Montezuma in the 18th century, and even, I mean, this is like a big parenthesis. So here I think I'm becoming as Baroque as Concierto Barroco. So I beg your forgiveness. Um, Algarotti, who is one major theoretician of opera in the 18th century, presents the conquest of Mexico as one of those subjects that are great for opera because they can show battles and fire, and, you know, destroyed things, etc., etc. So anyway, coming back to Carpentier, the what happens in that novella is that well, the Mexican criollo is very upset, and he says to Vivaldi, you know, everything that you showed on stage is falso. And he says, falso, 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 todo falso. And poor Vivaldi replies, well, you know what, you know, history and opera don't go together.
mm,
History is not the subject of opera. Opera is about business. So I wanted a good story, and you provided me with one. And at first, my first reaction to Carpentier's novella was that this was yet another example of post-colonial protestation.
mm,
Now, look what Europe has done to us. They have falsified the history of Mexico. What do we do now? And I think the interesting part of that problem is the last part. What do we do now? Because obviously the opera is written. You're not going to change it. Luckily, with different stagings, you can emphasize this or that, and that has
mm,
happened. That's actually a very interesting story of the history of Montezuma. But what I think Carpentier is actually doing in the novella is showing that this sort of binary between Europe and the Americas is problematic, that it's not as
mm,
simple as that. And Carpentier, as you know, was a musicologist himself
mm,
and was very much connected to different parts of Europe. You know, his father was French, his mother was Russian. He lived in Paris for many years. He worked for the Cuban embassy in Paris, and so on and so forth. As much as he tried to downplay that, you know, he was always, as you know, also criticizing the artificiality of European surrealism versus the naturalness of what he called lo real maravilloso.
mm,
So he gets rid of that binary, especially because one of the main characters is going to be this a person, Filomeno, who
mm,
is the Mexican criollo's servant. He's from Havana. He's
mhm,
black, and he is familiar with all kinds of musical instruments that have nothing to do with Europe, at least at face value. And it complicates the binary. And eventually, in the novella, you will see that jazz is going to play a big role.
mm,
Uh, Jazz as a transatlantic formation that depends on the collaboration, if you will, of musical forms associated with different parts of the Atlantic world, including quite clearly the Black Atlantic.
mm,
So in that sense, I thought, you know, Carpentier is actually doing what I want to do, which is to show the complexity
mm,
of all of this. So I was very thankful for his work. Um, And um, and it allowed me once I understood what Carpentier
mm,
was trying to do in my eyes to apply that kind of thinking to the rest of my corpus,
mm.
and go even back to El Fausto Criollo and say, well, it's not just about this binary, it's about that mixture, which is actually very productive.
Yes, it certainly brings complexity to your reading. I was actually laughing as I was reading about this Mexican criollo in Venice during Carnival, which is right
Oh, that's
now,
right.
dressed in these plumas, right? And
Yeah.
plumaje, and then complaining about Vivaldi's um, iteration of perhaps the world that he sees embodied in this character. So that was it was a very clever reading, I have to say. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you. So let's think about that idea of opera. Opera and history do not go together. Opera is about business. And you do talk about the arrival of opera in Latin America. Can you share with our audience today the story and context for La Púrpura de la Rosa, the 1701 opera by Pedro Calderón de la Barca? Again, the sort of the more flexible definition of a Latin American author, perhaps here, as it is staged and presented on that side of the Atlantic where you are right now.
Yeah, that's a great question. And here I first and foremost want to thank all the musicologists who worked in opera before my own arrival, as a literary scholar, because they've obviously done incredible work. For the story of La Púrpura de la Rosa, his first performance in Lima at the
Mhm,
Viceregal Palace there in 1701, I am indebted to Louise Stein, a musicologist at Michigan, who has written extensively, and she traces the connection between that first performance of an opera to the celebration of the new dynasty in Spain. As you know, it's the time of Felipe V, Philip V, the first Bourbon, and how the viceroy in Lima wanted to commemorate this new historical development, a major historical development in Spain with this performance. And there's something quite conservative about the choice of the libretto.
mm,
It's, as you said, La Púrpura de la Rosa by Calderón de la Barca, which had already been set to music in Spain
mm,
for another royal occasion, the marriage of, now I forget, but it goes back to Philip IV, um, um, and Louise Stein has all of this in her works. But what I find interesting is that obviously Calderon has no idea this happened because he died well before his libretto
mm,
was reset to music in Lima. So he
mm,
is an unwitting participant in all of this. But what I wanted to do with the libretto, and this again has to do with my own uh, training as a Latin Americanist, was to see how you could perhaps read it from the present moment,
mm,
uh, preposterously, if you think about it, because there's a historical context in which it was written. There's a second historical context, which is when it was reset to music in Lima, so
mm,
Madrid, Lima, and then now I come here with a reading that engages with Latin American 20th century theorizations of the Baroque and the Neo-Baroque. What happens if we read, let's say, Severo Sardui before reading Calderón de la Barca? And some people kind of freak out because, it's like, how can you do that? Here, I want to mention Mike Ball's book on Caravaggio. It's a book titled Quoting Caravaggio, in which she actually discusses this idea of the preposterous, taken from history, taken from T.S. Eliot as well, which is how we perceive works from the past through the lens of present day works or works that came later. And in her case with Caravaggio, she says that it's impossible for her to continue seeing Caravaggio without the lens provided to her by US Latino visual artists. And I thought, this is very clever. What happens if you read Sarduy and then you read
Mm,
um, Calderon? All kinds of things happen, which I think make it actually uh, far more of a work that can be engaged with Latin America, that engages with Latin America. The whole idea, for example, of hybridity is very
mm,
clear in the story of Adonis. La Púrpura de la Rosa is the myth of
mm,
Venus and Adonis, and it has to do with the transformation of these bodies into different things. At the end, La Púrpura de la Rosa is the blood of Adonis being transformed into a star, etc., etc. Things that made me think of mestizaje. And I will confess to this small group here today that I'm not completely persuaded by the absolute validity of my argument. I won't go as far as saying this is the correct way of reading La Púrpura de la Rosa, but I will just present it as one way of reading La Púrpura de la
mm.
Rosa. And in my next life, if there is one, I want to be an opera director, and I will have a staging of La Púrpura de la Rosa that incorporates Severo Sarduy one way
Mm.
or the other. It's going to be very sexy, I can tell you that. And I think Calderon would be very pleased. So this is what I was trying to do, and I think I'm desperately awaiting for more reviews to see what other people might think of this. 'Cause-
Certainly is not your typical reading of an opera or Severo Sarduy, let me assure
Yeah,
you.
that is true also. What would Severo Sarduy say?
Yes, exactly. So it's a very surprising moment in your book. But
Hmm.
I think that your book is so full of those moments. And let's go back to sort of the city, because you talk a lot about different cities in Latin America, but I think two come into more focus
Mhm.
in your book, which are Havana and Buenos Aires. And both have very good reasons why I think you focus on them.
Mhm.
Um, but let's talk a little bit about Havana, because you do say that in Havana's case, opera is an excuse to talk about his cultural history. And I think in a way it's true because you talk actually, again, in these surprising juxtapositions, what comes through that chapter is actual discussion of contemporary film, Fresa y Chocolate, for
Mhm.
example, or
Mhm.
actually on a singer uh, and a lot of people involved in telling the story of Malibran.
Mhm.
So can you expand on sort of what took you to Havana and how you're playing with these lines that goes through opera, but actually allows you tell, I would say, a particular history of that city?
That's a very interesting question for me. I I started thinking about opera and Havana when I read a book by John Díaz called Opera in America. And it's a fabulous long tome on the
Mm,
history of opera in the United States. And it devotes one entire chapter to what he calls the Havana opera companies in the
mhm,
mid-19th century. And these were actually Italian opera companies that had gone to Havana and kind of used Havana as their base to tour different parts of the Americas. So one of these Havana opera companies went to New Orleans, and then they would go to St. Louis, other important cities in the Midwest, end up in New York, perhaps, and they would be the first to perform, for example, the Italian bel canto repertoire, your Bellinis and Donizettis, and to think about that weird trajectory, that weird transport of, let's say, Bellini from Italy to Cuba to the United States, I think it just shows the weirdness of it all, especially because at the time, Havana is a colonial city. Cuba is still very much a part of Spain. So the whole idea of the metropolitan center becomes complicated because here we have a colonial city that acts, that functions to some extent as a um, 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 uh, center for a European art. And then from there, you can start seeing, for example, different formations of this Havana Cuban fascination with opera. There's a fabulous book by titled Pasión Cubana por Giuseppe Verdi, which um, traces the reaction of audiences to first performances of Verdi in Europe, in the Americas, in Havana. By the end of the 19th century, by the way, Havana is no longer that important operatic center. Buenos Aires is.
Mm.
So the late operas by Verdi were first
Mhm.
performed in Buenos Aires, no
Mhm.
longer in Havana. Rio also plays a huge part
Yeah.
in Verdi performances. Um, but then, what happens with the history of opera later in other episodes? And you mentioned Fresa y Chocolate. And Fresa y Chocolate engages with opera. That film, those of you who have seen it may remember the episode in which one of the protagonists, the gay protagonist, invites the other protagonist, the straight guy, to his apartment, and he plays for him Maria Callas. And it's that. I mean, and here, of course, there is another important chapter in the history of opera, which is the connection between opera and homosexuality. And there is that very famous book by Wayne Kostenbaum, um, uh, The Queen's Throat,
Mm.
which I think is important to discuss Fresa Chocolate. But what matters there is how the gay protagonist says um, about Callas, it's a qué voz, what a voice. And
Mhm.
then he adds, con la falta que nos hace otra voz aquí, with the need we have in this country for another voice, which is obviously a political statement of sorts, given that it's going to be a movie about politics. And so this return of opera through the gay protagonist is dangerous. He
Mhm.
ends up having to leave the country at the end, even as the straight guy now likes opera and listens to opera on the radio. So I think it's a complicated story that also engages with one of the crucial themes of Cuban cultural history, which is race and ethnicity. So the other important text that I bring up here is the biography by Mercedes Merlin of the singer Maria Malibran. And
Mhm.
Mercedes Merlin was a French-Cuban author. Malibran developed, I think, mostly as a French singer, but she was of Spanish descent. Um, and her family had been involved in yet another interesting transatlantic transport in the first performances of Rossini and Mozart in New York. Her father, anyway, it's as you said, Rosi, one story leads to another. So it becomes really baroque. But the story of race that I wanted to finish my discussion of Havana with is when the French Cuban Countess Mercedes Merlin, which is better known as La Condesa de Merlin, arrives in her parents' in her family's house in Havana after having lived in
Mhm.
France for many years and having been a sort of musical presence. She had an important salon attended by Rossini, Chopin, and other people like that. She returns to Havana, and one morning she wakes up and she hears somebody singing an aria by Bellini, and she's fascinated by the power of that voice. So she looks up and she finds out that it's actually a black enslaved woman who is singing, and she says, how I wish that we could take her to the stages of Europe because they would be fascinated by her, not only her
Mm,
voice, but also her physique.
mm,
And I just find it interesting that there are all of these convergences of opera, Cuba, race, politics, and so on and so forth that make opera kind of like a natural presence in the cultural history of Cuba.
yes. And actually, you do mention about even the racial background of Malibran, right? At some point. And
Yes.
speaking about the voice, that the lack of voice, because you think about the lack of recording of Malibran
Right.
singing,
Right.
right? So that search. And actually, I'm going to point out here a very interesting connection since we are connecting dots here that her accident, that was her demise, it actually happened in Manchester. Uh, so she had her what ended up being her lethal accident on a horse actually happened in Manchester. So we're circling the circle here, or we're closing the circle here. I'm going to ask you one last question, and I'd like to open the floor to our audience members. If you want to ask questions to Roberto, please either start typing in the chat box. I will read them for him. Or if you want to open your camera and your microphone, you're welcome to join us here in the conversation. Um, I know that I've sent you a couple of questions that we can explore here, but actually I'm going to change that question because we talked a little bit about the reviews that you've received about this book. And I thought that yes, they're a bit ambiguous, and I'm with you at how you take such a reading of your book, but also made me realize as a non-musicologist, but also very interested in music. As you know, I also have my side project on music. And the challenge of writing about music, when you're not playing music, when you cannot communicate music in ways that you could do it by playing an instrument, by singing, and so on. So I think that the question of where is the music in such a project, it's both fair but terribly unfair as well. So when you are putting, or when you are actually developing this project, how did you think about sort of that idea or the question or the subject of music, and how you bring it into, I don't know if it is the fold or maybe the juncture of all your
Yeah.
research and analysis, and and actually mostly analysis and connections, right, in your project?
That's a great question, and it's, as you know, it's very difficult to convey the emotions of music with words. Some people have a real talent for doing that. In Los Angeles, we had a music critic, Alan Rich, who wrote for the LA Weekly, who
Mm,
could, with 10 words, put you right there in the middle of a performance of Beethoven's Seventh, let's
mm,
say. Um, I decided early on that my book was not going to be about music because that has been done.
mm,
I think there's sufficient work on all of the composers that I treat in my book by musicologists who examine important questions. And I do think that I do refer to those questions. For example, to what extent is the music of opera in Latin America, um, or by Latin American composers in the 19th century, revealing of their national origin? We can take a composer like Gomes, the
mm,
great Brazilian composer who was um, working at La Scala shortly after Verdi and so on and so forth. He has operas that deal with Brazilian history,
mm,
but his music is, for the most part, firmly entrenched in the European musical tradition. So I refer to that, and I also refer to the couple of occasions where you can sort of detect
mm,
something that sounds more Brazilian. Um, But it's true that I don't deal with that. I am hoping, though, that as people read my book, they will listen to opera. Maybe if
Mm.
you can listen to music at the same time, it will be a richer experience. But yeah, it's really a fascinating challenge to any for any writer to say describe the emotions of music.
Yeah, because I don't know if it is description as you said, that critic that could put you right there. But I
Hmm.
think that you also are able to be right there if you already understand music. Because
Hmm.
I think that even in musical writing, there is an idiom that they use. There is a certain code, right, that is able to communicate that musical moment or experience. But if you're not familiar, or with that language, is also something that is not accessible to you. So I think that
Hmm.
what I'm getting at is that we seem to use the same languages, but in a way we're speaking very different languages as we trying to sort of merge music and perhaps other kinds of linguistic exercises.
Yes, and at the end, when I started my working on my book, I was trying to decide who the audience was. Was it going to
Mm,
be psychologists or literary scholars or both? And as I kept writing, I realized that my closest audience was other literary scholars who are not necessarily familiar with opera,
mm,
with musicology, and so on and so forth. So it became a challenge
mm,
to sort of bring in the music. Um, and sometimes, I mean, the reason why I refer to Alan Rich, who was a music critic and not a professor of musicology, is because I also wanted to write a book that would perhaps appeal to people who are not academics.
mm, mm,
And I was told by publishers, yeah, one great thing about opera books is that opera lovers who are not professors or um, scholars of any sort like reading. So there is
mm.
apparently this basic connection between opera lovers and the practice of reading. So I'm hoping,
Okay.
yeah.
That you'll find your audience there. And speaking of audiences, let's take some questions if our listeners want to open their mics or their videos and perhaps ask some questions. We'll give it a minute. They're always shy, Roberto. Yes,
Yeah.
Pedro.
I have a question. Yes, fantastic talk. You mentioned the companies of opera that were based in La Habana and then they toured the Americas. Did they have an influence? Afterwards they had like companies as business to promote opera in Latin America, or was mainly the European companies that went to America to promote the genre?
It's a very complicated question, absolutely. And I think from all that I've read, the Italian companies based in Havana did have an influence in the development of opera in the United States by exposing audiences to this new repertoire. It was actually very new of the Italian bel canto. But at the same time, it was limited. These companies couldn't travel to too many places. One of the musicologists that I have read, who has worked on the circulation of opera, mentions how difficult it would be, for example, to travel from Havana to Buenos Aires in the 19th century. That chances are a person would go from Havana to somewhere in Europe and then back to the Americas to get to Buenos Aires. So yes, it's an important movement, but at the same time, it does have its own limitations.
And actually,
Thank you.
going back to that question of the U.S., even though U.S., geographically speaking and politically speaking, is a complicated space at the moment. You do highlight the importance of the U.S., both as location and also sort of the cultural infrastructure that it provides
Yes.
in the development of opera in the new continent. Can you, what's your sort of read of that relationship?
That's such an interesting question. I think I mean, I don't want to simplify things in any way, but um, there has been a notion in the United States that Latin American operas composed by here should, in one way or the other, deal with Latin America. And one of the operas that I talk about in my book is Daniel Catan's Florencia en el Amazonas,
Mm,
which is a sort of a magical realist. And I was trying, I mean, from the questions that we've been discussing, Rosi, the question of the future of opera, of Latin American opera in the United States,
mm,
as I'm sure all of you know, there's this big reaction against diversity, equity, and inclusion. I wonder what's going to happen next to Latin
mm,
American composers. But at the same time, I just wanted to mention one of the things that I learned about when I was researching this book, which is that the first opera performed at the Kennedy Center in Washington was Beatrix Cenci by Alberto Ginastera,
mm,
the great Argentine composer. And that particular opera has nothing to do with Latin America. I mean, Ginastera is obviously Argentinian, but at that time in the 60s, I don't think there was any pressure
mm,
for a Latin American composer to come up with a Latin American story. Like
mm,
there was pressure on Daniel Catan to not write an opera based on a story by Isaac Dinesen, but to write something along the lines of Garcia Marquez, for better or worse. So we'll see what happens next, but
mm.
it's an interesting juncture.
Yes, especially now, what's coming down the road.
Yeah.
Yes. Do we have any more questions from our listeners? If I haven't seen anything, although I think there was a whiteboard being activated at some point.
Uh,
But
yes,
yes.
I'd like to ask Roberto about what about the contemporary opera in the Americas? Because I suppose that you're also been studying and you're an expert in the field. How these by mutual influence are perceptible in the opera, the composers of the contemporary opera.
In Latin America.
Yeah.
It's as I kept researching this book, I was finding even more and more operas. I think it's at the end of chapter 2 that I come up with a list of all the things that I have seen are being done. Um, One of the big developments in Latin American operatic culture is the emergence of OLA, which is Opera Latinoamericana, and it's an association of opera houses, opera companies in all over Latin America, as well as a few in Spain. And what they're trying to do is promote the art of opera as well as contemporary composers, etc. So, I mean, I think opera is very expensive to produce, as I'm sure you all know. So, and to invest in a new opera is a risky proposition because you never know how well it's going to do or not. Um, but my thinking is that more operas are going to be written, and hopefully they will circulate more easily from country to country. Um, I mean, I think one of the sad things is that many of the great operas written by Latin American composers are not staged as frequently as they should.
Mm,
The Teatro Real in Madrid did a Ginastera not long ago, Bomar, so that was great. A theater in Italy did Gomez's Lo Schiavo not long
mm,
ago. That's great. But they have not penetrated the the operatic repertoires
mm.
as I think they deserve to. So we'll see what happens to that older history of Latin American opera.
Thank
And thinking about how a lot of the singers actually leave Latin America to sing in
Yes.
international stages.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's actually a fascinating thing that so many Latin American voices are in charge of envoicing European composers.
Mm,
Um, and no one I think bats an eye in the sense that no one says, "Oh, why are you singing European opera?"
mm,
But it's an interesting, I think, development in the whole idea of transatlantic transport and post-coloniality and the decolonial, if you will, even. But
mhm, mm. I'm gonna ask one more question before I let you go, Roberto, and our
please.
audience, because in your afterword, you discuss actually Thomas Edison's The Tempest.
Mhm.
And you actually finished your book with, I think, sort of a question of what will happen with opera sort of moving along when
Yeah.
Caliban loses his color, when stories can be staged and played in such different places and in different contexts.
Yeah.
And in a way, your search for these connections, this, in a way, origin stories perhaps, but what makes it specific to the many places that you go through in your book. So,
Mhm.
what's your outlook? While now that that you've done the research, that you've written the book, what comes next?
Oh, I think that it's time to listen again to all of these operas. And you mentioned The Tempest by Thomas Addis, the very fabulous English composer. And in the afterword, as you alluded to, I sort of explored the idea that his take on Caliban is not necessarily that of a racial other,
Mm,
which in a sense might be read as an erasure of much Latin American literature in which Caliban is reinterpreted as a
mhm,
racial other that speaks to some extent for Latin America. But it's that complication, that erasure, as well as the formation of a new thing that I find
mm,
is interesting. I think perhaps opera, because music can be understood by everyone, is well poised to come up with new reconceptualizations of nations and continents and cultures. Thomas Addis has famously rejected political readings of his works. Yet, of course, that doesn't stop critics from viewing the political dimensions of what he does. And they're all very interesting because Addis, who incidentally spends a lot of time in Los Angeles and is therefore very much connected to the American scene, has written also other operas that incorporate tango rhythms, for instance.
mm,
His opera Powder Her Face, which is a completely English opera, what's her name, the Duchess of Argyle and the scandal of at a hotel, has tango music. So then you
mm,
think, oh, this is actually really wonderful that a composer can move around continents and languages and musical formations so expertly and in a sense make everything more visible and audible.
mm.
Coming up
Thank
to
you.
I would
Yeah.
like to add just something that we are very proud in Manchester because we are bringing some opera from South America, from Latin America. We had Juliet Lozano in Leeds. It was last year. She was the winner of the best soprano from the BBC contest in Britain in 2022. And we are having Lorena Paz in May from Argentina, another soprano in the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester. You are all invited. I wanted to mention that because it's very important for us to bring some of the opera from Latin America to the United Kingdom in this case.
Thank
wonderful.
you. Thank you so much, Pedro, for the invitation. Roberto, that's our next date, our next opera that we're going to see together.
I
Thank you
hope.
again, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Instituto Cervantes, again, and Pedro for hosting us. Thank you, Roberto, for accepting our invitation. And we'll see you for the next installment of Ex Libris. I think you'll be in person sometime in April. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Muchas gracias. Thank you.